With the release of the Sega Genesis Mini, fans are wondering what Sega's next move is on the retro hardware front, chomping at the bit for a Saturn or Dreamcast Mini. Given the nature of these games and hardware, I firmly believe we are far more likely to see a Dreamcast Mini first. So I decided to throw together an episode to take a realistic look at what we would see in such a release. I tried to keep it very realistic in terms of licensing. If it requires multiple companies to come together, or is under some kind of exclusivity deal that would require crazy money, I left it out. This means I did not target games like Marvel vs. Capcom 2, sports titles, or any other licenses of a complicated nature. We are still left with the possibility of a solid lineup of titles, and I've chosen 20 games I'd love to see on the device. I hope you guys enjoy my 20 games for the Dreamcast Mini. Of course, you have to have the Sonic Adventure games, both of them. It's true that these games have not aged the best in regards to gameplay, but there is a fun factor and nostalgia in these titles you can't deny the fans of the series. They still look and run great for the most part, and Sega completely owns both IPs, making it an easy one to add. Shenmue started its retail life on the Dreamcast, and so it has to be a part of any celebration of the system. Again, these games have aged quite a bit in the nearly 20 years since their original releases, but they are so much a part of the experience of that hardware, there would be a gaping hole without them. Crazy Taxi is a tough one. It's a big part of the Dreamcast experience and a great arcade game. The problem is, the music of this one would likely be changed if it's included, something that can have a big impact on the enjoyment for some. I still think it's worth having it, just be aware that it will sound a bit different than you remember it. This is a tough one. I really did consider the ramifications of adding this to the list. It wasn't a great port in the slightest, and some will even go so far as to say it's virtually unplayable. I can't argue with the disappointment, but Sega Rally 2 was still a game that holds a lot of nostalgia for me. I wish it was arcade perfect, but I'll take Sega Rally any way I can get it.
200, easy left, in ground. 300, long, easy left.
I won't try and mask my love for this game. It's the best bit of software Sega created for the old Dreamcast, and a game that is an absolute must for a release like this. The system didn't have a lot of RPG representation on the platform during its short life, but this one is so good, I didn't care a lick. When Soulcalibur was released, it was a shining beacon of hope for the platform. It showed off the system's graphical prowess, and was from a company that had been one of Sony's biggest supporters. This surely meant the Dreamcast was here to stay, right? While it ended up not really meaning anything, it was still one heck of a great fighting game, and one Sega absolutely would need to secure for this release.
One, fight!
Capcom had a big presence on the Dreamcast during its life, releasing tons of software that contributed heavily to the greatness of its library. One of these heavy hitters was definitely Street Fighter III Third Strike, a fantastic port of the CPS-3 arcade original. 2D fighters hold a certain charm and appeal, and this one would be a great addition to the Dreamcast Mini.
The mark of my dignity shall scar me. Prepared, go! You feel win. Alright, that's cool.
Treasure contributed a couple of great titles to the Dreamcast, and Ikaruga was a big one. Coming off of the excellent Radiant Silvergun, Treasure decided to add some mechanics here beyond your typical shoot 'em up. It looks and sounds great, and plays unlike anything else on the system. The Dreamcast didn't receive a Panzer Dragoon game unfortunately, but it did get a game by some of the members of Team Andromeda called Rez. It's an on-rails shooter in a highly stylized world that takes place inside a supercomputer. Again, it was one of those games where it simply had no equal on the old Dreamcast, and I think it'd make a fine addition here. You say we have Skies of Arcadia and it's enough. Heck no, because Grandia 2 was a great game as well. Saturn owners in the US and Europe got utterly shafted on the original game, but luckily the gods took mercy on us here. A great battle system and story awaits, and what was the best version of this game available at the time. I was a big fan of Dead or Alive on the Saturn. I thought it looked and played great, but the Dreamcast sequel was a massive improvement in every single way. Much like Soulcalibur, it's still very playable today, and is still one of the best looking games on the hardware.
Get ready, fight!
One of the major draws to the Dreamcast was Capcom's continuation of the Resident Evil franchise, Code Veronica. Even with a number of re-releases since then, this is a game that must be included. I can't tell you how many times I played through this when it was released. Its blend of scares, comedy, and exploration pretty much perfect at the time. Still love it to this very day. Soul Reaver didn't show up first on the Dreamcast, but it was there that I enjoyed it the most. Open world mechanics, lots to explore, and a story that still resonates strongly today. It would be well worth the addition. Zombie Revenge wasn't Sega's finest piece of Naomi software, but its port to the Dreamcast is still quite unique. Think of it as a third-person House of the Dead, and you should be pretty close to how it plays. It hasn't seen much notoriety since the Dreamcast release, making it a perfect throwback for the Mini.
Damn it.
I was always looking out for games that did something you didn't expect, and Cannon Spike certainly falls into that category. This peculiar shoot 'em up features Cammy from the Street Fighter series, and is played in a top-down perspective. It's another one that hasn't seen much love outside of its Dreamcast days, so I'd love to see Sega go after it for this compilation. die-hard arcade fans rejoice because you have to have Dynamite Cough. This is actually the sequel to the game Die Hard Arcade was based on, Dynamite Deca, with this being called Dynamite Deca 2 in Japan. You know what to expect here: arena-style beat-em-up combat, shooting, and quick-time events. It wouldn't be home on anything else. One of the coolest things about the Dreamcast launch was the prospect of truly three-dimensional fighters. Power Stone showed us a world where fighting games weren't restricted to a 2D plane, and while it was an adjustment, it was still a great look at what could be. I enjoyed both games on the Dreamcast and wouldn't be angry to have either one. While this entry into the Daytona series does not play as well as the arcade or Saturn versions of the original, you still have to love you some AM2 inspired racing goodness. This is sort of a reworking of Championship Circuit Edition from the Saturn, with a fresh coat of paint and some new music. It takes time to adjust to the gameplay, but lots of nostalgia here nonetheless. Many systems rarely see a lot of shoot-em-ups, but Sega definitely needs to secure Border Down. Not only is it a fine-looking game with great backgrounds and special effects, it also has a unique difficulty system in place to challenge you no matter your skill. Shoot-em-ups this good shouldn't be left behind. This one didn't begin life as a Dreamcast game, but it sure worked out great as a port there. If you were a fan of the arcade or Saturn originals, you will love this great looking and running version. Model 3 ports typically fared poorly on the old Dreamcast, but this one turned out just fine. The mini retro hardware business can be a lucrative market for these companies. Nintendo sold millions of the things, and there were lots of excitement surrounding Sega's own Genesis and Mega Drive Minis. This can also be a perilous market if something is done to garner you the disdain of your target fan base, as Sony experienced with its PlayStation Classic. In developing and releasing a Dreamcast variant of these machines, Sega would take on a much more powerful and complicated architecture than it ever has before. I have a feeling that this would mean that they would see it as high risk, and shoot for the dedicated retro fan with a machine that would be quite a bit more expensive than we are used to seeing. A Dreamcast Mini would almost certainly be well over $100, which begs the question, how much would you pay for a machine like this? It's a question Sega has likely been asking itself for the past few years. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.